Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. Thank you to everyone for attending. My name is Dave Knapp. I'm an economist at the University of Southern California and an MPI in the Gateway to Global Aging Data. I help lead the Gateway's policy initiative, and today we're going to have a webinar that is an introduction to the Gateway's education policy series. Before we begin, I want to thank the NIA for their generous support. We also wanted to highlight the Gateway as a free public resource that's designed to facilitate cross-national and longitudinal studies on aging using the Health and Retirement Study and its international network of studies. So to talk a little bit about some motivating principles. So the Gateway Policy Explorer, which covers not just education, but a broader set of policies, is it meant to be a tool that captures historical policy changes over time of the surveys covered by the Gateway to Global Aging data. Collecting this data about social policies affecting older people across the world provides crucial context for these survey respondents. Many of the International Network of Health and Retirement Studies now cover more than a decade. For example, the Health and Retirement Study is is 33 years old, and other studies in the International Network are now over 20 years old. During this time period, policies have changed substantially within a country, and in some cases, that's going to be a very large barrier to cross-national research. Furthermore, policies vary significantly within a country, which is going to be a barrier to longitudinal research. So the Policy Explorer seeks to support the broader Gateway effort and reduce these barriers for researchers by collecting and consolidating key policy information for retirement, long-term care, and most recently, education policies. Now, I want to take a quick look at the Policy Explorer's overall efforts before we dive into the education policy topic area. Today, we'll be talking about the education policy series, but we also have a retirement policy series, which we had a webinar on last May, and a long-term care policy series. There are several different parts to each one of these topical areas. So for within the education series, there's the Policy Explorer initiative, where we collect detailed policies, link that information that we provide back to the original laws, and where possible, provide an English translation of the original legislation. We do this in a consistent fashion across countries and states for which we collect the information. And the policies that we are focused on at present include compulsory schooling policies, as well as educational tracking. And so today's webinar is going to be focused on the compulsory schooling policy, and we'll be releasing the education tracking policy later this year. Future efforts will include researching policies like the reduction and elimination of school tuition and fees, financing education reforms, and early childhood education and care. Those are currently under collection. Once we've identified the detailed policy information, we use it, as noted in the second column here, to create harmonized variables. So for the education series, these include the school start and leaving ages, as well as the duration in school based on birth cohort. The final component is contextual data, which is not necessarily data that we are collecting, but is data that is collected by other data providers and helps provide useful context or helps to contextualize the information that we would see at the individual level within the international network. And so for education, this might include measures such as student-to-teacher ratios or expenditures per student. Within the retirement series, the Policy Explorer documents focus on policies that define eligibility for coverage, as well as income and asset tests. Based upon this information, the retirement team develops harmonized variables that captures eligibility for public pension benefits and pension system generosity. Contextual data for this policy area includes measures such as the fraction of people working by age and the percent of people in poverty at ages 65 or older. Within the long-term care series, the Policy Explorer documents focus on policies such as eligibility rules for long-term care benefits, the care needs assessment, and means tests to become eligible for those benefits. From this information, the long-term care team is in the process of developing harmonized variables that help capture the eligibility for long-term care benefits based upon an individual's care needs, as well as based upon their resources or their means, much like their income or assets. And then contextual data for this policy area will include things such as bed availability rates for skilled nursing facilities by region and the average cost of different care types. And so now what I'd like to do is I'd like to pass it over to Michaela Wenner, who's one of the project specialists working on the education policy collection. Michaela?
Okay. So the Education Policy Series collects historical policy information during periods when HRS-INS respondents and their children would have been affected. So as Dave just mentioned, we're currently tracking two types of education policies across both the US and Europe. So these are compulsory schooling policies, which regulate the ages and duration that individuals must attend school. And then there are also educational tracking policies, and these determine the different educational paths that individuals can take in school, such as academic or vocational routes, as well as when and how they can be sorted into these paths. So at this time, international and US compulsory schooling policies are available on the Gateway Policy Explorer website, and educational tracking policies will be released soon. So here's a brief overview of our education collection efforts at present. Currently, for compulsory schooling, we have documentation completed for 25 countries, 8 Indian states, and 40 US states, and this is available on our website. And then there are 2 countries, 21 Indian states, and 12 US states with their documentation in development. And finally, we have 23 countries in development for educational tracking. So we're now going to shift our focus to discussing compulsory schooling policies specifically. We've collected compulsory schooling policy changes going back to the middle of the 19th century, which is when these policies were first being implemented in the US and Europe. However, it's important to note that when calculating birth cohorts, we start with the January 1900 birth cohort. And this date is important because it captures those individuals who are covered in the HRS, which started in 1992, and it surveys people in the US aged 51 and older and their spouses. Now, when reviewing compulsory schooling legislation, we developed cross-country and cross-state harmonized measures to facilitate our analysis. So compulsory schooling policies are typically defined by 3 main features. These are the age that an individual starts attending school, the age that an individual leaves school, or the total period of time that they are in school. Typically, 2 of these 3 components are specified in the law, but sometimes all 3 are named. So first off, many laws state that individuals must reach a certain age before starting school. However, we're interested in a harmonized starting age measure to facilitate our cross-country and cross-state comparisons. So harmonized starting age is defined as the age that an individual reaches during the school year that they begin compulsory schooling. And if a law does not specify the harmonized starting age, then we create this measure by taking the age reached before the school year starts and adding 1 to that. Next, we have the leaving age, which is defined as the age that an individual reaches in their last year of compulsory schooling. If the leaving age is specified in the law, then we use this value, but for laws that don't specify it, we impute it by adding together the harmonized starting age and the duration and then subtracting 1. Finally, duration is defined as the required period of compulsory schooling, and it's measured as the sum of completed school years. If duration is specified in the law, then we use this value. But again, for laws that don't specify duration, we have to impute it, and we do this by subtracting the harmonized starting age from the leaving age and then adding 1. So to better understand the context of compulsory schooling laws, we have also collected child labor policies from 1900 onwards for US states. Whereas compulsory schooling legislation requires students to be in school for a minimum period of time, child labor laws provide exemption to these rules. So an individual with a work permit would be in school for a shorter period of time than their peer without a work permit. There are 4 different kinds of work permits, which I'm about to get into, and all of these provide exemptions to compulsory school attendance to different degrees. So first off, we have a full-time work permit, and this is our main measure of interest in this area because it enables a minor to be lawfully employed to work during school hours for the entire time that day school is in session. Next, we have a part-time work permit. This is a little more restrictive, and it enables a minor to be lawfully employed to work for some portion of the day during school hours on days when day school is in session, and restrictions are placed on both the time of day and the number of hours of school that the permit holder may miss due to employment. Next, we have a vacation work permit. This enables a minor to be lawfully employed to work during times when school is not in session. So this would include after school, weekends, holidays, summer vacation, and this permit does not exempt a minor from school attendance. And then finally, we have a hardship work permit, and this is the least common. It's provided to minors who can demonstrate financial need and whose income from employment is essential to support themselves or their families. So now I'm going to pass it off to Kelly Luo, another one of our project specialists on the education team, and she's going to talk more about the Policy Explorer key features.
Yes, so we're now going to show you how to use the Gateway Policy Explorer website, first for international compulsory schooling policies and later for the US. You can access our website at g2aging.org/edu/education-policies. The key dimensions that we capture in the Policy Explorer are the policy, country, and time. With these dimensions, we are better able to look across countries in a single year and within one country across many years. For each country and state, as we mentioned previously, we upload the original legislation, and then we detail how we develop our measures and compare our findings within those existing literature. So this is our landing page for the Gateway, and if you go to the Policy Explorer tab at the top, you can see our different policy options. So we're now going to select Education Policies, and there is a brief description at the top of the page, and we also include a link to a short video showing you how to use the website if you ever need a reminder. For international compulsory schooling, we currently have available 25 countries and 8 Indian states, and we are currently working on adding more countries and Indian states soon. We can use the Explorer by selecting one or more countries or states, selecting a year range, and clicking the button View. As an example, let's choose England and France and click on View. Here, you can see that the figure compares policy details across countries and time, and by hovering over the figure, we can see the details of the minimum school leaving age in both England and France effective for cohorts born between 1900 and 2020. For example, if we hover over 1933, we can see that the minimum school leaving age for the cohort born in 1933 increased from 14 to 15 for people born in England, while remaining at age 14 for people born in France. Additionally, you can switch to see the minimum school duration in both England and France by birth cohort. And when we scroll down, we can see the country profiles for the countries we selected. In this case, we can see the information for England and France. For each country, we have 3 sections. First is a policy history at the top, which explains how compulsory schooling changed across time. Next, the policy-making context explains shifts in the country's past political or governmental structure that might affect how education policy is established or executed. Lastly is the effective policy by cohort section, which details how we calculate the birth cohorts affected by the policies and compares our calculations to others in published research. A PDF document containing this policy documentation for all countries is also available by clicking this gray button at the top of the country profile. Each chapter is reviewed both by internal team members and external stakeholders. All the documents have a DOI, an introduction describing our technical approach, and a breakdown of the policy by country. And if you return back to the website, you can also select this gray button here to see the sources. We include both links and archived versions of the legislation, and in countries where English is not the native language, we usually also include translations as well, unless there is no translation available. I'm going to pass this back to Dave, who will talk about how to use international compulsory schooling measures with HRS-INS data.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I'll do is I'm going to go through a process now of talking a little bit about how you download the policy data that you see on the website, and then link it up with some of the available data resources that are available through the gateway. So bear with me a moment. So hopefully everyone can see this screen. Okay. Kelly, can you confirm that you can see my screen okay?
Yes, I can see it.
Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do is we can imagine a situation where we've downloaded or we've created a folder. I'm calling it the education webinar. And the goal here, right, is to essentially take the education data that we have available on the Gateway's website and link it up with, uh, harmonized data from the international network. So I've gone ahead and created a do file here. So for those of you who are familiar with Stata, this should look familiar. These files will be posted on our website after the webinar. So in order to actually appropriately use this, we need a couple things first, right? We need to first, through the Gateway website and through our international partners, we need to make sure that we download and get the data associated with the surveys that we're interested in. So here for the international network, we're going to use both ELSA, which is the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, as well as SHARE, the Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe. And so if you don't already have this information available, what you'll need to do is you'll need to go to the Gateway's website, harmonize data, get data, and then you'll essentially need to sign up for access to these data sets because they're going to be released by the actual data providers themselves, which is the uh, University College London for ELSA, as well as Share Berlin for the Share series. And so you can essentially access these data access instructions, and it's going to kind of walk you through what you would need to do in order to do that. So assuming that you've already done that, what I've done is within a folder structure on my computer, I've essentially created a data folder that has the ELSA data as well as the share data that's already in there using the file structure names associated with those files. I also have within my education folder the do files, as well as a folder called data, which is currently empty, and a folder called output, which is currently empty. And so I'm going to show you what I'm going to populate that information with. So here under the Policy Explorer, I'll return to our Education Policy Explorer page, and I'm going to select the countries that we're going to take a look at their, basically link up the education policy data with what we have in Share. So we're going to take a look at Austria, Belgium, England, France, and then Spain for today's example. And I'm going to click View. And so you can see here that now all the information is provided, and you can see some interesting context there. And today, I think the focus of our example is going to be looking at the reforms that occur in this 1950s time period. So we see that in Spain, right, there's a jump of about 2 years. In terms of the leaving age, in terms of duration, there's a jump of 2 years. And we also see a jump in Belgium, as well as Austria and England. The only country we don't see a jump during this time frame is actually Belgium. And so we'll use that as kind of a nice reference case to see whether or not, relative to Belgium, where there is no reform in the 1950s, whether or not we see, a flat, or no response in terms of educational achievement, whereas we do see a jump in educational achievement for the other countries. And so in order to download this data, what you do is you can go up to the little 3 horizontal lines in the upper right, and you can click Download CSV. And so we'll go ahead and do that. We're also going to do the same thing for minimum duration. We're going to download the CSV for minimum school duration. And so returning to my downloads folder, we now have that information there. So what I'll do is I'll label them, I'll give them a specific suffix. So I'll just call it international for now. And then I'll do the same thing with the school leaving age. I'll give it a suffix of international, just to distinguish it from our US case, which I'll show you in a little bit. Now, to give you an idea before we kind of jump into merging it with the share data, I want to show you what the data actually looks like. So I have it here in CSV format. So what you can see is the information that we've downloaded has birth, month, and year. And then it has essentially in the duration, in the school duration file, it has the years of compulsory schooling duration. And so you can see here for people born in January 1900, it was 8 years in Austria, 7 years in England, 5 years in France, and 6 years in Spain. And so the idea here, right, is that this then makes it easy to merge with either, studies in the international network or a broader set of studies that have this information available. And as you can go down, if you scroll down and we think about kind of a more recent time period, we can then look at, say, people who are born in January 2013, and we see that by January 2013, right, the minimum schooling duration in these countries are 10 in Austria, 12 in Belgium, 11 in England, 10 in France, and then 10 in Spain. And so this is the type of information that we're going to be merging on to our data sets. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. Nope, not going to save it. And we're going to go ahead and move these from this folder. So I'll copy them. I'm going to copy them into the data subfolder within the education webinar. And now I'm going to go ahead and open up the do file that I created, or actually I already had it open. And so this is, I'll briefly walk through how we upload this information into the do file and then how we're going to merge it on to our harmonized shared data and harmonized ELSA data. So there's just some user inputs here. And again, we've set it for international. I have a date suffix here of June 24th, 2025. And for our initial comparison, we pick a target year. And so the interest here, right, is trying to capture policy reforms in the 1950s. And so what fraction of people are actually achieving what is eventually going to be the 1960 requirement for compulsory schooling across countries, recognizing that the change in compulsory schooling is going to be different across these countries in the 1950s. So if I kind of narrow the time frame here from 1940 to 1965, just to make it a little bit easier to focus on what we're going to be looking at, we want to see reforms in this 1950 or in the 1950s and understand what fraction of the population is achieving the educational or the compulsory schooling requirement that is in place in January 1960. So for England, that's going to be 11 years. For Spain, that's going to be 8 years, Austria, 9 years, and then France, 10 years. And so that's 1960. We have a range of different birth cohorts before and after. So then we need to link up. So first thing we're going to do before we even bring in our harmonized share and harmonized ELSA data is load up the international data or the harmonized or the minimum school leaving and the minimum school duration policy data. So we named it international .csv. And what we do is we import the delimited CSV file. We convert the year month measure into status data time format. And then we rename the variables. So instead of Austria, Belgium, England, France, and Spain, I rename them to policy school leaving age 11. Age 11 being 11 is the country code that Share assigns for Austria. And then you'll see policy school leaving age 23. 23 is the country code for Belgium. And so this is then again going to make it easier to merge on to the harmonized variable or the harmonized data sets later on. We drop some superfluous variables and then we reshape it from wide to long. And in this way, right, what we end up doing is we end up having a measure then of essentially by country and birth year, what each one of these measures can be. And so that'll make it much easier when we go to merge on our policy data onto the Gateway harmonized share data and Gateway harmonized ELSA data. We repeat the same exercise for school duration. So again, we import the file that we downloaded, so minimum school duration underscore international. And we go through the same post-processing. And here in section 1.3, what I do is I take those two files and I combine them together. So we basically have one consistent harmonized policy data file that can be merged on by birth year and month. and then we save it as a temporary file. Now then we can proceed to load on and combine the share and the ELSA data. So we go ahead and load some of the core data from the harmonized ELSA file. With the harmonized ELSA file, we don't know the birth month, right? So unlike with share and the HRS, ELSA does not publicly release the birth month. And so we're going to, for simplicity of this exercise, assign a birth month of 4 to everyone. We will, in the not so distant future, in coordination with ELSA, be releasing a file as part of our harmonized measures that will capture the educational semester that people are born in, which will then allow people to more accurately reflect the education policy that people were exposed to within England. But that's not yet available. We assign a country code of 1 to ELSA because since ELSA is a separate study than SHARE, it does not have a country code. But in order to facilitate kind of the combined use of the data, we assign a country code for it. And then it has a different name for its unique identifier. So we rename IDA unique, which is the unique identifier for ELSA, to merge ID so that the eventual combined data set will all have a common unique identifier. We go through the process of recoding some measures. So the education variable in ELSA is the year that people left school. And so what we end up doing is we translate that into an appropriate duration. So, or years that they're leaving. And then we save the file as a temporary file. And then for share, we do the same process. So again, we load up the share data. We restrict to the countries of interest. So that's 11 is Austria, 23 and 24 are Belgium, reflecting the differences in language within Belgium. So there's a French version and a Dutch version. And then there is 17, which is France, and 15, which is Spain. And there, the education variable is then going to be their education years. And so again, that's the most comparable thing for duration. And so we convert that into a standardized measure. For our purposes, we're capping it, although that's not necessary for this exercise. And then we append it together. So now we have a combined data set that has both ELSA and SHARE all in one. Once we do that, we generate birth month year across the data set. We replace it to be 3 if it's otherwise missing. The nice thing about SHARE, or one of the nice things about SHARE, is that they have the birth month, so that'll allow us to have a more accurate representation of the policy as it's implemented. And then in section 2.3, we merge on the policy data. And so now, after this step, we'd have basically a combined SHARE ELSA harmonized data set with our harmonized policy measures from the gateway. And from this, we can then create an indicator of whether or not the educational duration achieved by the individual exceeds the target policy school duration. And so that target policy school duration that we're setting, right, is the 1960 policy. So for whatever policies in place in 1960 in a country, in a specific country, we want to see whether or not individuals have achieved that level. And so the idea here, right, is, leading up to the period of the policy reform, we shouldn't see as many people achieving the 1960 level requirement of compulsory education. And then in the year of the policy reform and thereafter, right, we would expect that most people are achieving the required compulsory schooling duration. And of course, as we'll see, that is sometimes true and sometimes not. So after all of this, we do a couple more adjustments, and then we go through the process of creating graphs. And so as part of these graphs, right, we'll create a measure that's called time to reform. So in England, the reform occurred in 1957. In Austria, it occurred in 1951. In France, 1953. In Spain, it was 1954. And if you recall, there was no reform during the 1950s for Belgium. And so we just, as a simple baseline, choose 1955, although it could be any particular year. In section 3.3, we do some simple regressions to kind of linearize the period before and after, the 10 years before and after the reform, just to understand a little bit about where the trends are going. And we'll show you both a figure that shows the raw data in terms of educational achievement before and after the reform, and then we'll show you one that kind of linearizes the periods before and after, just to get a feel for what it looks like. So we're going to go ahead and run that do file. And let me actually click off of this. So let's see. Okay, so there we go. It's produced the figures. So let me go ahead and just show you what those figures look like. And we're going to open. Okay, so give me a moment to drag them there over on my other screen. Okay, so what we observe here is the use of our policy data combined with the Gateway's harmonized data sets for ELSA and SHARE. And so here t equals 0 is going to be the year of the reform in a particular country. So for Austria, that's 1951. For England, that's 1957. And kind of a common thread that you see as you look across these periods before and immediately after the reform is that you see kind of a spike, a jump in the year of the reform. And so what you don't see is a spike in the year of the reform for Belgium. So like in 1955, remember there was no reform, we just chose that arbitrarily. You see that it's relatively flat. And so this is kind of indicative of the fact that these education policies are salient, right? They are affecting the percent of the population that's achieving the compulsory schooling duration requirement. But there are a couple of things to emphasize, right? Across these countries, we know that they have different requirements. So they're all responding to the policies, but they're not achieving the same level of education. And on top of that, for most of these countries, it's not 100%, right? So for England, right, that was a very salient reform. You saw that the percent of people achieving the required level approached 100%, but was never 100%. And in these other countries, right, it's usually well below 100%. So the compliance with compulsory schooling requirements is not always is not complete across many of the European countries. And so then if we linearize it, you can see again, right, that a common thread is that across this time period, there's also an upward trend in educational achievement. And this is just a word of caution for people who want to use this data, right, is that there are these upward trends in educational achievement over time. And so if you want to use this for, say, instrumental variables or for other causal analysis like difference in differences, you really need to account for the time trends. So for England, right, you can see here in the orange, you can see this kind of trend upwards over time. And then in the year of the reform, right, it jumps by nearly 15 percentage points. And so then it remains relatively flat thereafter. So you don't see continued growth in England. As an interesting alternative, right, you see that for France, there's a more gradual increase in educational achievement. Then there's a jump of about 8 percentage points. But that trend continues afterwards. So people can, there's a broad increase in educational achievement over the period covered in this presentation. And so this is an example of how you can use the data. There are many other ways many other questions that you can tackle now that you can kind of combine and merge these data together. But with that, I think we're going to stop talking about international compulsory schooling now, and we're going to pivot and talk about US compulsory schooling. So I'll pass it back over to Michaela.
Thank you. Okay, great. So for the US, we currently have 40 US states available in the Policy Explorer, with others to be added soon. So to view the US states, we're going to select the US Compulsory Schooling Policy tab, and then you can choose one or more states and click on View. So for an example, we're going to choose California and Virginia. So as Kelly just demonstrated for international compulsory schooling, by hovering over the figure, we can see the minimum school leaving age in both states by birth cohort. And then you can also switch to see the same information for minimum school duration. And just to pause a moment here, so immediately upon first glance, we notice different patterns in the timing and type of reforms implemented in California and Virginia. So California experienced longer periods of time in between compulsory schooling reforms, and the duration typically increased by 2 years for each reform. So for example, the December 1904 birth cohort was in school for 8 years, and then the next reform affecting the December 1960 cohort changed the duration to 10 years. And then later for the December 1971 cohort, we see the duration jump up to 12 years. Meanwhile, in Virginia, we see much shorter increments in between the reforms, and the duration goes up by 1 year each time. So then by scrolling down, we are able to see the state profiles for both California and Virginia, which include an overview of compulsory schooling policy changes right at the top. And then we have an effective policy by cohort section for compulsory schooling, followed by an overview of the work permit policy changes, and then an effective policy by cohort section for the work permits. And I want to briefly highlight here the effective policy by cohort section for compulsory schooling again. So here we walk through how we calculated the birth cohort down to the month and year that each policy first affected. So for example, we explain how the 1919 California reform, which raised the leaving age from 15 to 16, first impacted individuals born in December of 1904. And then if you return to the figure at the top of the page and adjust our years of interest, you can again see that this policy change occurred in December 1904 for that cohort, so that zooms in. And again, this information is also included for international compulsory schooling, which Kelly talked about earlier. And then finally, you can access the PDF containing the policy documentation for all states, as well as the sources for each profile by clicking the gray buttons at the top of the selected state profiles. There's for California, and then for Virginia. And now I'm going to pass it back to Dave, who will talk about how to use the US compulsory schooling measures with other data sources from the US, such as the US Census.
Okay, thanks, Michaela. So we're going to go through a similar example to what I had just done with international compulsory schooling, but now with the US compulsory schooling policy. Instead of using the Health and Retirement Study, which provides state-level information, but in a restricted format through the MICTA data enclave, I'm instead going to use IPUMS data, which is data that has been harmonized for the US Census. And so briefly, I'm going to highlight where you would go to get that data and how I structure it within my folders before I dive into talking about how we would link up the policy data from the Gateway to Global Aging data with that IPUMS data. So let me go ahead and I'll share my screen again. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll just highlight where you would go to get the IPUMS data. So for those of you who are not familiar, IPUMS is out of the University of Minnesota, and I think they go by IPUMS now, but I think it was Integrated Public Use data. And anyway, they release information on a number of different resources, say within the US Census and American Community Survey microdata, as well as CPS data, international data, a whole bunch. So it's always worth a visit to their website. If you go into IPUMS USA, what you can do is you can select data from the different data resources. So they have household information, person level information, an A to Z search, etc. Now, I've already created a data set for the purposes of this webinar. And so I'm going to go back to one of my data requests, which is data request 25. And I'll show you what I have requested from them. So essentially, I've requested two samples. The first is a 1965% sample of the US Census. And another one is a 1980 sample, a 5% sample of the US Census. The measures that I've requested are year, well, you can read them here, year sample, and they'll be in the do file as well. Importantly for our analysis today, I've requested the birth year and the birthplace and their educational attainment. So some important things to note is that we don't know exactly where they live at, or we use the birthplace, right? Not necessarily where they live at that point in time, because we're interested in adults' educational achievement. And so this makes kind of the strongest assumption that people don't move out of state in the analysis that will follow. And people have made this assumption in other settings where they have this data limitation where you can't really tell what state people lived in at the age where compulsory schooling policy is going to be most likely affecting them. I would caveat that if you do get access to the restricted HRS data, the HRS does ask respondents where they lived at age 10, which gives you kind of that extra decade to get them closer to the compulsory schooling ages, which are typically the ones that are most affected or leaving ages between the ages of 14 and 18. So in a perfect world, right, we would know where people live between 14 and 18, which is something that you can get once you get life histories that have residential histories. Okay, so with that, just birthplace information here, they have codes. They're using FIPS codes, which are, typically between, I think, 1 and 56 for US states. So you'll see that in some of the information that I'll show you in a little bit. They also have educational achievement. Now, importantly for educational achievement, they have just grades 5, 6, 7, or 8, nursery school to grade 4, and then 3 corresponds to grade 9, 4 corresponds to grade 10. Grades 9, 10, 11, 12, these tend to be kind of the compulsory schooling limits. So that's going to be the most relevant for our analysis anyway. And you'll see how we use that in the data. So once you've established kind of a data extract, right, you can download it. And what they do is they assign these numbers to them. And so I'll show you what it ultimately looks like when you download it. So within my data folder, I also have an IPUMS folder based upon the information that I've downloaded. The download will include a codebook, a .dat file, which is the data file, and a do file, which essentially, which is what you're going to use to import the information into Stata. And you notice that it's used the unique identifier associated with my extract from IPUMS, which is 00025. And so I'll have that as an input to my code as well. But before we go further, it's important to note that if you are going to use IPUMS data, you do have to edit their file in one place, right? You need to essentially specify what is the directory associated with where that .dat file is. And so that's going to be on line 27. So once you've made that change, what you can do is we'll go back to our education webinar folder, and we're now going to open up compulsory schooling with the 1960 census. And so essentially this file is going to look very similar to what we were looking at before. We're now going to look at a target year, though, of what the policy is in effect in 1940 for our 2 states of interest. So just to kind of remind ourselves, so we were looking at California and Virginia. So we'll view the entire time block there. And what we're interested in is we're going to look at the educational achievement in 1940. So by 1940 in both states, the school leaving age, which is the typical policy set in the US as well as in England, duration is more commonly used in Europe. We see that the school leaving ages for both of the states were 16. And so we want to understand what fraction of the population achieved that age 16 requirement. So the problem is of course, if it's a 1940 policy, right, the 1960 census is too early, so we would have to use the 1980 census. But if we want to look at the California policy, we might want to go a little bit earlier in time. So we're first going to use the 1960 census to see if there's a policy response to California's policy. And then we'll use a 1980 census to see if there's a policy response to this reform for Virginia's policy. But before I do that, I do want to highlight kind of an important detail, which is that, just because we provide you these harmonized measures, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't read the documentation. And I'll show you why that's important as part of this presentation. So while we focus on California's reform here, affecting the December 1904 and later cohorts, I'm also going to show you that there was a reform in Virginia in 1920, in and around 1920, that affected a subset of municipalities within Virginia that will actually turn out to be important, but is not represented on this figure here. And so if you read the Virginia documentation, we go through a whole bunch of policy detail, and within the effective policy by cohort, we talk about how we establish each of these policies. One thing that is missing that's not included there, right, is this 1934 reform, which provided cities and school districts with the option to raise the leaving age to 16, but they were not required to do so. So we don't show it in our table because it's not a requirement. It was an option the state provided to the school districts. But as you'll see, it seems as though many of the school districts or many of the municipalities actually took that up. So now switching over to our do file, we're going to open up our do file, and we're going to, again, set the target year to 1940. So that's when they had that school leaving age of 1960. We're going to choose the IPUMS sample of the 1960 census, and then we're going to show our two states that we're comparing. And so we're going to use a reference year of 1905 for California and a reference year of 1920 for Virginia, since we know that there was that innovation in 1920 for Virginia. And so again, we need to download our data. So returning to the website, we need to make sure that we download it to the appropriate location. So we'll go up here to our 3 vertical lines. We'll download the CV for the minimum schooling age. And then we'll also download the CSV for the minimum school duration. We will come back over here to our downloads folder and we'll rename it to _USA and rename our school leaving age to, again, _USA. We'll then copy this information over into our data folder and then return to our do file and make sure that we update the names in the data file correctly. So it's _USA. And then we will save it. And then if you continue to look through this, I won't go through it in detail. Again, it'll be posted online, but you can see essentially just as we did with the international data set, we load and format the policy data. We then load the IPUMS file, select on the sample of interest, which in this case is the 1960 census, and then we select alternative. We make adjustments to the education variable so that it correctly reflects the grade achieved. Again, the census doesn't include the birth month, so we assume that everyone was born in March. And then we merge on the policy data. So we're left with a combined file of the census information as well as our policy information. And then to create our education measure of interest, we want to essentially take the grade completed, add 7. That's going to give us the age that they were at when they completed their final grade, and ask whether or not that was greater than or equal to the target policy's school leaving age. And then we'll run essentially, we'll run the data and produce the same graphs. And so when we do that, it will take a little bit longer because these files are a couple gigabytes since you're talking about a 5% sample of the census. We'll give it a moment here. So you can see here, these are the measures that were part of the IPUMS data set. Okay, and now we're rolling and we have produced our figures. And so returning to our folder structure, we can look at the output. We see now that we have education linearized 1960 census, and we also have another one that's the 1960 census. And so if we open that with preview, close out the old the international one, provide you the example of what it looks like. Okay, and so what we see here, right, is the California reform in 1905, again, had a sharp jump in educational achievement, as did that reform in 1920, which was an optional reform. So we saw a large jump in Virginia as well, although not huge. But one thing that we notice across these two states, as we did notice internationally, is the sharp time trend associated with educational achievement. So the fraction of population achieving these compulsory education requirements were increasing over time. And you get into later years, right, there's near complete compliance with compulsory schooling requirements. If we linearize this, it would kind of it would reveal what we saw descriptively in the graph, right? Is that they both have these upward time trends. And in particular for California, right, you have a jump just around the policy innovation or the policy reform, and then a continuation of the trend. Whereas in Virginia, right, you see a little or a smaller jump, and the trend doesn't continue at the same rate. So I think that's reflecting the differences in how the policies were implemented across the states. So just to close out with one final additional concept or a word of caution, right, is that just because there's a reform many of the reforms we've looked at, right, they've had an effect, but they don't always necessarily have an effect. And so that's why we've picked out California and Virginia. So looking now, shifting from the 1960 census to the 1980 census and focusing on that 1938 reform in Virginia that made it mandatory for the school leaving age to increase from 15 to 16. So the school year 1920 reform was just optional. The mandatory one occurred in 1938. If we change our sample to 1980, focus on the same reform, and now use 1938 as our reference year. So we're going to say that there was no reform in California, but our reference is going to be 1938. And for Virginia, we do have a reform in 1938, and so we'll just note that. And so now we're going to run it again. This time it'll be run on the 1980 census, so we'll also change the name of it. And so this was the 1938 reform was the actual reform in Virginia that made it mandatory that everyone achieve at least 16 or could not leave school before age 16. And by that time, of course, California had implemented it many years before. So it's not going to be surprising in these figures that we see a much higher level of achievement of at least 16 years of education. But what's going to be surprising, right, as I will now show you, is the fact that you do not observe the reform in Virginia. And that's perhaps because they made it optional so much earlier. So you can see this kind of upward trajectory of people achieving that 1940 compulsory schooling requirement of a school leaving age of 16 years or later, but you don't see any type of policy, you don't see a jump in educational achievement in the year which the policy was implemented. And again, for California, if you look at in and around that policy date, you don't see anything. And the linearized pictures are going to show you the same thing. So it's important to recognize that not even though the policies may sound similar, the way that they're implemented across countries can differ quite a bit. And so with that, I'm going to ask Michaela to toss up our kind of wrap-up slides here. And I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us today to learn more about the Gateways Education Policy Series. I'd like to say that while we've invested a lot of time here in collecting this information and providing it through the Gateway to Global Aging data, it's not necessarily true that it's perfect. So we've sent it out for review. We've done a lot of background checking, and we present all of our original sources, but it's always possible that people find mistakes. And so if you do, we ask that you please email us at policy@g2aging.org, or if you have questions, you can email us at policy@g2aging.org, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And so the Policy Explorer is meant to be a dynamic database that we're constantly updating the documentation to ensure its accuracy as a useful reference for people. Right now, both the international and the US compulsory documents are on version 1.1. We are preparing versions 1.2 for both of those series, which will be released sometime this summer. Version 1.2 for the US will include the rest of the US states, as well as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Version 1.2 of the international series will add Romania and Finland. Finally, I'd like to conclude by saying thank you to everyone who has helped collect education policies and prepared these documents for the Gateway Policy Explorer. This work has been largely divided across two teams, one at the University of Southern California and the other at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And so a big thank you to all of those researchers, as well as the external reviewers who helped double check our work and provided us valuable feedback. So with that, I'm going to stop and we'll open up a Q&A session to take any questions that people may have. And so you should be able to drop questions into the Q&A if you have them. And if you don't, you can always email us later at policy@g2aging.org. Thank you. Any questions? So we'll give people a couple minutes to type questions in. Okay, not seeing any questions. We'll go ahead and close up the webinar. This video presentation will be posted online, as well as the code and the slides. So, and you can get those by going to the Gateway to Global Aging. Let me just really quickly show that. You can find that information by going to the Gateway's website. If you click up here under additional resources, there's webinars and presentations. And so you'll see the information posted here shortly. Okay, so again, that's additional resources, webinars, and presentations. Thank you very much. We hope you have a wonderful day.